Alright, ladies, shut up and sit down, TC called over the hubbub of conversation. To be honest, it was kind of ridiculous that she needed to ask at all, given that she was the captain, and thus the crew should have been jumping up to salute her with obedient silence the moment she entered the ship's small cafeteria lounge area. Unfortunately for her, captaining a tiny picket ship like the Whisker didn't carry that kind of prestige. More to the point, it was difficult to maintain any kind of professional distance when you were in tight confines with the same group of 7 people for weeks at a time. Fortunately, the group of layabouts she was saddled with were still obedient enough. While they weren't quite as prompt as she might have liked, the conversation did fall away, allowing her to speak. "Glider? Rocket? You hearing me up there?" she asked. "Loud and clear, Captain," the ship's intercom squawked overhead. "Good," she nodded. Between those 2 on the bridge and the 5 before her, the entire crew was present. "As I'm sure you've all already heard, we'll be getting a replacement for Badner when we next pull into port." All around her she saw people nod, though the one who did so most vigorously was Kernathu, which wasn't all that surprising given that the poor girl had been running double duty to compensate for the missing member of their complement. To be honest, it was kind of ridiculous that the Whisker had launched at all without a full crew, but then again she supposed that was just a natural consequence of being posted to Gurathu. It was about as backwater a posting as one could get without literally manning a weather station on an ocean world. "Please tell me it's not another Rakiri," someone groused from the back. "It's already bad enough that I'm picking Yarrow's hair out of the drain every other night." To her left, the crew's sole Rakiri crewmate just chuffed in amusement, the furry bipedal woman more amused than offended by the insinuation. "Forget a Rakiri, I'd kill for another Halchem," Scales muttered, the aristocratic grey-skinned woman running a hand over the eponymous black scales that ran up and down her forearms. "A lower caste, of course. It's been forever since my scales received a proper buffing." "I offered to help," her fellow Marine offered. Scales gave the muscular Shilvanti sitting next to her a cool-eyed glance. "Yes, and you nearly descaled me in the process." Assis just shrugged, as if to say, "At least I tried." TC coughed before Scales could respond, and allowed the crew's odd couple to get into yet another argument. "Well, before I have to listen to any more suggestions as to what you do and don't want in the latest member of our security contingent, how about I just tell you?" The crew fell dutifully silent. Sighing, TC continued, "They won't be a Rakiri, Halchem, or even a Shilvanti. We're getting a human." She'd been expecting it, but it was still kind of surprising how still everyone went. You could have heard a pin drop in the ensuing silence. Even Cirilla looked a little interested. Then the questions came all at once. TC didn't even try to decipher the deluge of blurted words from about half the crew. Instead, she slammed a fist onto a nearby table. "Quiet," she hissed, silencing them all instantly as she scowled. Sighing, she collected herself. As her eyes roamed over the room, she noted with some contentment that most of the crew looked at least a little sheepish about their outburst. As they should, she thought. For all that their circumstance allowed for a little laxity in military protocol, this was still a military ship, and she was still the captain. They were all well behaved enough on planet, but sometimes when they were out in space, all of them needed a reminder of what she represented. She was the captain. Her word was law, and all of them were expected to give her rank the respect it deserved. Content to let the matter lie now that they'd all been reminded of that fact, she continued. "Yes, they are male," she answered, figuring it was best to get it over with. It was fortunate for her that she'd just reminded them all to behave with some decorum, because she had a feeling that if she didn't, she'd be listening to them all whooping and jeering right now. Kernathu in particular looked about to explode from joy, and even Cirilla looked interested despite her self-proclaimed disinterest in men. Of course, there's disinterest and then there's disinterest, TC thought. Lots of girls like to get into relationships devoid of males, but few enough would pass up an opportunity to try one, if it came up. It was a rare one that abstained entirely. Of course, from every indication she's seen, TC was pretty sure that Cirilla was one of those rare women. Her gut instinct was that the chief medical officer's current interest was entirely professional, rather than romantic or sexual. The same could not be said for the rest of her crew, however. "All right, all of you get your heads out of the gutters," the captain instructed, before the thus far silent excitement could reach a fever pitch. Not that she could particularly blame them. Even out on a backwater like Gurathu, where wheats could pass between messenger ship circuits, they had all heard about the Imperium's latest acquisition. TC was pretty sure that half of it was Turok shit, but then again, even if only a fraction of what she'd heard about the humans were true, well, she could understand what all the hype was about. Not that she intended to do anything about it when their newest crewmate arrived. She knew some captains liked to play their part of the noble in the parlour, but TC was better than that. Her only relationship with the newcomer would be professional. Well, unless he offered. She had standards, but she wasn't dead after all. Snapping her mind away from that line of thought, she fixed the motley crew in front of her with a stern eye. "Now, I don't need to remind you, but I will anyway," she began. "We're an Imperial naval vessel. That means you are expected to treat our newest crewmate the same way you treat anyone else." She'd gotten a very sternly worded memo with pretty much those exact same words, in addition to her newest crewmate's dossier. "The last thing the Navy wants is another scandal like the Iron Tooth," she said, which served to put a significant dampener on the party-like atmosphere that had been developing. Which it should. The Iron Tooth incident had been a black mark on the reputation of the Navy as a whole, and while those women were now all in military prison, the effect of the scandal on male recruitment rates was still being felt 2 years later. Still, at least it had brought a number of new rules and regulations into being for active duty ships. She knew some members of the military chafed under them, but her thinking they were just good sense. "We aren't a band of periphery pirates," TC said, echoing her own thoughts. "We're here to do a job, not just indulge our own whims." The crew as a whole nodded, even Assis, prompting TC to smile with pride. Her crew might not have been the most disciplined bunch in this part of the galaxy, but when push came to shove, they were all good people. Shulvanti, as a race, were predispositioned to high temperate conditions. Many of their earlier civilizations had cropped up around the tropical climates of Shul's equator. Unfortunately for Assis, Gurathu was anything but warm. It was a frigid iceball of a world, filled with mountains so large it made the ones back home look like a kid's sandcastle by comparison. Sure, the main colony had been set up in a valley between two of those mountains, keeping it more or less sheltered from the frigid winds of the world, but that didn't make the freezing temperature any less oppressive to her senses as she and the captain stepped out of their car and onto the busy streets just outside the spaceport. "Ma'am, why am I here?" Assis asked, as she locked the vehicle and the two started making their way towards the nearby building. A task made marginally harder by the crowds of very Rakiri colonists that made up an overwhelming majority of Gurathu's population. Just last week, the spaceport had been a ghost town. Today that wasn't the case, though. With a large cargo ship coming in, the place had filled up with natives hoping to load up or receive things. "Upset that I'm taking you away from your away time with Scales, Sergeant?" The captain teased, as they strode past two brown-coated furry aliens, arguing loudly with a tired-looking Shulvanti customs officer. If they were still in space, Assis would have rolled her eyes at her superior's comment. They were on planet, though, so she refrained, keeping her features studiously neutral. That was part of the strange dichotomy the crew of the Whisker shared. It was an old joke, anyway. For all that the crew liked to joke that the pair of them bickered like two rival wives in a marriage unit, they weren't together. They were just friends. Which ironically was less than a lot of girls in the services were. While the reputation for girls enjoying each other's company while out on deployment was a pretty gross exaggeration, it was a stereotype that held some truth. Assis and Scales had never done anything of the sort, though. They were just two friends who liked to bicker. "Not at all, ma'am," Assis drawled dutifully. TC hummed thoughtfully as they flashed their credentials at the Shulvanti militia guarding the terminal entrance to the new arrival. "I assumed that as the leader of our little marine contingent, you'd be interested in seeing our newest arrival firsthand." Assis shrugged. She wasn't too bothered, to be honest. Whether she saw him today or a week from now, when the Whiskers set out for patrol again, didn't really matter. It wasn't like she could send him back if she didn't like him for whatever reason. Ignoring the fact that she was pretty sure the crew would mutiny if they didn't get the human, it would be weeks before the next message ship came through, and they would be out on patrol before that happened. "Apparently our newest addition is some kind of tactical savant," the captain continued, ignorant of her thoughts. "Managed to take on an entire company of interior elites with just 2 other recruits during the training exercise." "How?" Assis asked skeptically. On a purely practical level, she was pretty sure free recruits didn't have enough ammo to gun down that many of the opposition. TC shrugged. That my dossier didn't say. Probably some kind of guerrilla thing. You've heard how humans are. Aziz nodded warily. Everyone had heard the stories about the latest race to be added to the Imperial fold. Specifically, the fact that they had a 50-50 gender ratio, and that the males were just as randy as women. That wasn't what TC was referring to. Earth wasn't all that dangerous. Ignoring the myriad other advantages the Imperium held over the native population, the fact was that most of the natives' weapons couldn't penetrate through Shuvanti armor. That made being out on patrol a whole lot less of a daunting prospect. That didn't mean it was totally without risk. While the aliens apparently lacked in weapons acumen, they surely made up for in tenacity and creativity. The number of homemade rail guns that had been popping up in recent weeks was proof enough of that. Crude, sparse, and slow to fire as those weapons were, they destroyed the assurance of many a patrolwoman that their armor was proof against anything the natives could throw at them. The place was still considered a pretty sweet posting compared to the likes of the periphery, practically a vacation even. But it seemed that with each passing month, the number of injuries and casualties amongst the occupation force grew, rather than diminished, which was the opposite of what was supposed to happen. The numbers were beyond middling to the Imperium, but it was still a worrying trend. Here we are, TC said, as they passed through another checkpoint and back out onto the recently swept open tarmac of the landing pad. Personally, Aziz would have preferred to stay in the heated building and watch through the viewing port, but she knew better than to voice that opinion. That they'd be standing outside waiting for the ship to arrive had been a foregone conclusion anyway. As her slightly blue snow-tanned complexion could attest, the captain liked to take every opportunity she could to be out in the open air while they were on planet. It was almost as if she was compensating for all the time they spent in the cramped confines of the ship. Well, that wasn't strictly fair. The Whisker was actually pretty spacious for a picket ship, with a fairly large number of amenities for its small size. Of course, all the amenities in the world couldn't detract from the fact that it was a limited area, and that the crew spent weeks and occasionally months stuck there. So she supposed she could forgive the captain's need to stand out in the freezing Guruthu air, even if Aziz was pretty sure the tips of her ears were beginning to form icicles. Anything I should know, ma'am? She asked, as they peered out into the great blue sky above. He's a boat. Aziz glanced at the woman next to her. I figured as much, ma'am, being human and all. TC determinedly kept her eyes on the sky. No, Sergeant. I meant basic boot. That made the Marine pause. No vocational, ma'am? She asked slowly. No. Now Aziz was fully staring at her superior. With all due respect, ma'am, what the hell? Basic training was called that for a reason. It installed all the basics that any member of the military might need. That was the key word in that statement. Basics. Vocational training was where actual skills were developed. Engineers, chefs, medics, hell, even your average riflewoman needed more advanced training to truly be considered competent in their chosen role. Advanced unit tactics, sweeping and clearing, how to call in orbital support, jump pack operation. The list went on and on. All skills that were needed for a team to be able to function correctly during an operation. Empress, it only got worse on a small picket ship like the Whisker. The ship's small complement meant most members had multiple roles. Aziz herself was entirely capable of filling in as a medical assistant should it be required, and Scales was an assistant chef. I was led to understand, as was the rest of the crew, that our newest member would be filling in for Bant, she gritted out, not needing to say that Kernathu would be devastated. The young mechanic was running herself ragged, keeping the ship running without aid. The rest of the crew tried to pitch in where they could, but they just didn't have the skills to be truly useful. The captain frowned, no doubt thinking the same thing. I don't like it much either, she allowed. Orders are orders, though. Between us, it's obvious that something funny is going on here. Aziz scowled. She knew exactly what that meant. Politics. The word felt foul on her tongue. She thought having a posting on the ass end of nowhere would get her away from all the politicking of back home. She supposed it just went to show that wherever the Imperium went, politics followed. The nobility were pathologically incapable of keeping their noses out of anything. The captain being the notable exception, of course. She was a fine no-nonsense leader, but even if she had her moments where that ingrained aristocratic instinct kicked in. Though it was unfair, Aziz couldn't help but wonder if this was one of those occasions, if the captain was accepting this human as part of some plot back home. "It's not all bad," the woman continued, completely ignorant to the sergeant's thoughts. "Apparently he was going to university in his homeworld, part of the Uplift program to familiarize the humans with our tech so they can finally start contributing." She paused. It was only partway through the course before he, signed up, but that should give him enough of a foundation to be of use. I'm sure Kernathu will get some use out of him. Aziz privately doubted that. Still, it wasn't her department. Her only concern was how decent he'd be in a firefight. Not that she expected to be in one, but that was neither here nor there. Searching merchant ships for contraband was already tedious enough without worrying if one of her underlings was going to shoot his foot off. "There it is," TC pointed. Aziz glanced up, and sure enough there was a blot in the sky above. It started small at first, but as the minutes passed it only grew in size. Soon enough she could make out individual details. The Grinshaw's Moor was built in the style of most Shilvanti ships, which was to say that it was essentially a brick with a set of oversized engines strapped to the back. The cargo ship was even uglier than most. Where most warships would have at least had a sleek array of laser pods running across the ship, this one had but one, mounted to the front. Instead of holding weapons, the side of the ship bulged out awkwardly to make room for the vessel's expanded cargo holds. As she watched it continue to grow as it got closer, she couldn't help but marvel at the sight. Nothing that big and cumbersome looking should have been able to move through atmosphere, nor should it have been so quiet whilst doing so. Nearly twice the size of the massive supercargo ships that used to ply Shaw's southern oceans, the thing's engines should have been blazing away in an attempt to just keep the massive construct in the air. Instead, they were all but silent, only occasionally releasing a small puff as the ship corrected its course. "Anti-gravity tech can be a real mindfuck," she murmured, ignoring the way the captain looked away from the ship to send her an amused glance. Kernathu had tried to explain it to her once, but it had all come out as gibberish to Aziz's ears. Like, what the fuck was gravitron? And why was it only sometimes a wave? She had no clue, and she had long since given up trying to understand. Finally, the ship touched down with a clunk. Then a second clunk as the anti-grav field turned off and the full weight of the ship dropped onto the landing struts. The cargo gates opened with a whirring noise, and massive heavy-duty ramps slid down. Almost immediately, cargo vehicles and exos began striding out to the behemoth to begin the gargantuan task of unloading its cargo before reloading it with exports from Gurathu. "Shall we go see the latest addition to our little family?" TC said, a hint of genuine excitement peeking through her expression. Aziz once more resisted the urge to roll her eyes. For all that the captain played the role of the no-nonsense officer, sometimes it was easy to see the excitable young woman that lay beneath, as evidenced by the fact that they were boarding the ship, rather than heading back inside to wait in the passenger terminal. Instead of doing that, Aziz did what all enlisted throughout history did when saddled with an excitable officer. She grunted, and grudgingly followed after her superior.